Samuel Little, born in June 1940 in Georgia, faced a challenging start. His mother, a sex worker, gave birth to him while incarcerated and abandoned him shortly after. Raised by his grandmother in Ohio, Samuel's troubled childhood was marked by violence and neglect. His early fascination with violence became evident in school when he displayed disturbing tendencies. He was expelled multiple times, leading to a life of petty crimes by his teenage years. By his early 20s, Samuel Little had developed a chilling fixation on strangulation, a fantasy triggered by childhood traumas. He idolized pictures of women in vulnerable positions and was fascinated by their necks. His first known murder occurred in 1970 in Miami. He lured Mary Brosley, a sex worker, to a secluded area and strangled her. This marked the beginning of a horrifying killing spree spanning decades. After his first murder, Samuel Little became a drifter, moving across the United States. He targeted women living on the margins of society, sex workers and drug addicts, knowing their disappearances would attract little attention. Between the 1970s and 2000s, he claimed victims in 19 states, using his charm and cunning to gain their trust before striking. Little's transient lifestyle made it difficult for authorities to connect the murders, allowing him to evade justice for decades. In the late 1980s, Little committed a series of murders in Los Angeles. 3 victims, Carol Alford, Guadalupe Apodaca, and Audrey Nelson, were all found strangled. Evidence pointed to a single killer, but investigators lacked leads. Decades later, advancements in DNA technology linked Samuel Little to these crimes, opening the door to uncovering his true legacy of terror. Little's modus operandi was disturbingly consistent. He would charm his victims, often offering them rides or companionship, before leading them to isolated areas. Using his powerful hands, he would strangle them, relishing in their final moments. His preference for marginalized victims delayed investigations, as their deaths were often misclassified as accidents or drug overdoses. Samuel Little's reign of terror began to unravel in 2012 when he was arrested in Kentucky on drug charges. A DNA match linked him to the unsolved murders of 3 women in Los Angeles. This breakthrough marked the beginning of a years-long investigation that revealed the staggering extent of his crimes. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Little struck a deal with investigators in 2018, confessing to over 90 murders in exchange for better prison conditions. He provided chilling details about his crimes, including hand-drawn portraits of his victims, many of whom remained unidentified. These confessions painted a horrifying picture of a killer who preyed on society's most vulnerable. Samuel Little possessed an extraordinary memory, recalling vivid details of his victims even decades later. He described their appearances, clothing, and even the conversations they had before their deaths. However, he often struggled to remember exact dates or locations, complicating efforts to locate all his victims. Little's ability to sketch portraits of his victims provided investigators with critical leads in identifying the missing. Little intentionally chose victims from marginalized communities, primarily African-American women working as sex workers or struggling with addiction. He believed their deaths would go unnoticed, and tragically, he was often correct. Many of his victims were misidentified, and their cases closed without thorough investigation, allowing Little to continue his spree unchecked. In 2018, the FBI launched a national campaign to identify Little's victims. They released over 30 of his hand-drawn portraits, hoping families or witnesses could recognize the women. This collaboration between federal and local agencies led to the closure of numerous cold cases, but many victims remain unidentified. Little's confessions revealed a horrifying timeline of his crimes. In one case, he described luring a woman in Mississippi in 1993, killing her and dumping her body in a field. Her remains were never found. Such details painted a picture of a man who operated with chilling precision and a complete lack of remorse. The 2012 arrest marked a turning point, but it was Little's confession 6 years later that truly exposed the scale of his crimes. Investigators were shocked not only by the number of murders, but also by Little's calm demeanor as he recounted them. His lack of empathy or guilt underscored his deeply psychopathic nature. Samuel Little was sentenced to life imprisonment without parole in 2014 for 3 murders. As his confessions unraveled, more sentences were added. Despite his advanced age and failing health, justice for his countless victims remained the priority of law enforcement. When asked why he chose his victims, Samuel Little's answer was chillingly calculated. He targeted women who lived on society's fringes, knowing their disappearances would go unnoticed. He once compared his victims to ripe fruit, claiming he could pluck them without consequence. Little's disturbing analogy revealed his dehumanizing view of his victims and his perverse justification for his crimes. The lack of records for many victims posed a significant challenge for investigators. Little targeted women whose lives were already invisible to most of society. Many cases were misclassified as overdoses, accidents, or natural causes. This lack of initial scrutiny gave Little the freedom to continue killing for decades. Behind each of Little's 93 confessions lay a life cut tragically short. Many victims were mothers, sisters, or daughters whose families never received closure. The trauma of losing a loved one to such a heinous crime was compounded by years of unanswered questions. Little's crimes left a devastating impact on countless lives. Advancements in DNA technology were instrumental in unraveling Little's crimes. Forensic evidence from decades-old cases finally matched his genetic profile, providing the breakthrough needed to connect him to unsolved murders. These scientific tools gave victims a voice, ensuring their stories were no longer forgotten. Little's ability to evade justice for so long was a testament to his cunning and manipulation. He presented himself as charming and non-threatening, which disarmed potential suspicions. His criminal record spanned decades, yet he continually exploited systemic failures to stay one step ahead of law enforcement. Samuel Little's crimes left a dark mark on American history. His reign of terror exposed vulnerabilities in the justice system and the societal neglect of marginalized communities. Though Little is gone, his story serves as a grim reminder of the human cost of systemic failures. Samuel Little died in 2020, leaving behind a legacy of horror and unanswered questions. While many victims were identified, others remain nameless, their stories lost to time. His case stands as a call for reform and vigilance, ensuring that no victim is ever overlooked again. Shadow Mysteries, unraveling the horrifying mysteries of crime cases. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel to catch the next thrilling and suspenseful episodes.